What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we are going to be going over hosting an online session. Now, this is going to be very basic. We are going to be going over hosting the session in full, but just hosting a session, there's a lot more that goes into actually hosting it than simply hosting it. It's not as simple as it sounds. So we are going to get the session started using Unreal's online subsystem method. So this is basically Unreal's default online system. This is not connecting to something like the Xbox servers or Steam or anything like that. Just hosting a session using Unreal's default subsystem. And to do this, we are going to be able to come into our game, press online, press host, and then you will see in the log a session has been created. Of course, we will go over this logic and we'll see what that really means. Now, we'll know that it's working because only one session can be hosted using this method with this name at the same time. And so, if we are to close the project, open it back up, do the same step, try and host it again, the session is going to fail to be created and is going to say that cannot create session with the name of game session because the session already exists. And that's how we know that we have properly used Unreal's online subsystem to create a session. It doesn't show anything different in this level because we haven't changed levels. We haven't tried to do anything with the session that was created, like have another player join, but we have been able to successfully create an online session, and this is the first step to online multiplayer. I'd like to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for everything, for all your kindness over the years, and for continuing to support me. I really appreciate it, and I hope you're enjoying everything about this series and about these tutorials. But before we get started on this awesome and exciting episode, if you'd like to get caught up in the series, check out everything we've done to this point in time. You can click this playlist right here in the top right corner. Check out all of our episodes from attacks to these special crazy stage intros and everything else in between. Alternatively, if you just care about online sessions and online play, I'll link you to this episode right here in the top right corner. And this is where we set up the host and join buttons so that you can go about adding those to your screen. That way you can follow along easily with the future online episodes. What we are going to be doing is pressing the host button and then using Unreal's default online subsystem to create a session. That session will then be able to be joined by another player, and of course then we can start going over what happens then. We will want the players to be able to select their own characters on the character select screen and then get into a match and all that goodness. So, to do all of this, it all starts with hosting this session. And to host a session, we are going to use Unreal's online subsystem. Now, quick note before we get started, I have upgraded the engine from 4.24.2 that I was on to the latest engine of Unreal Engine 4. I have not upgraded to Unreal Engine 5 just yet, even though I test everything in the fighting game on Unreal Engine 5. I'm still sitting on Unreal Engine 4 right now until we get more information about rollback. I'm working through it, and I want to make sure everything is right on Unreal Engine 4 before I move it to Unreal Engine 5 because there are some massive things that I have to consider. So I'm still on Unreal Engine 4 right now, but I have updated it to the latest version of Unreal Engine 4. That way I have all the changes and I have everything at its latest capabilities and I know what we're dealing with. So that is not required. It doesn't need it for this episode, but I decided to go ahead and do it. And if you do decide to make this update like I have, there is one simple thing that you have to change. So when I was in Unreal Engine 4.24.2, I did not have this issue, but in our fighter template character.cpp successful taunt function, the method of clamp has changed from 4.24.2 to 4.27.2. And so my clamp logic here was giving me an error. So this commented out logic right here was working in the series and working in 4.24.2, but after updating it was not working. So I have updated this one singular line to get rid of that compiler error. That way I could actually build my code. But you might not have to do this. It depends on the version you are on already. You might have already had to do this. So if you had this logic that I have here, now it is required that you set the value of the clamp to a value. So before I was using fmath clamp, and I was using super meter amount and adding the meter gain to it. but then also using that as the clamp value. The 0.0 and the 1.0 are the values to clamp to the min and the max. They can remain the same. But now, instead of doing the plus equals inside the clamp function, it is required that we do supermeter amount equals the fmath : clamp with supermeter plus meter gain, not plus equals. And doing that will get rid of that error. So it's a minor thing, and it only is going to happen if you actually upgrade your engine like I have, but it is important to note just in case anyone does run into that problem. We're going to remain in the code, but we're going to go to our base game instance.h now. Our base game instance is where we want to create our functions for hosting and joining games. So in base game instance.h, I am scrolling down to where I make my functions, and I'm making one function today, and that is the host session function. And quite simply, it is to host an online session. I've made the function blueprint callable, so ufunction blueprint callable. That way I can call it from the main menu when I press the host game button. That's how we're actually going to trigger creating the session. And I've called the function void host session. Now, if we go into the base game instance.cpp, we're going to need to include some things to do this, but before we can even do that, we need to allow these modules to be present in our game. And we've done this for a few things before, but we need to go to our project name.build.cs, open that up, and we need to add some things to this public dependency module names section. So we had added things like UMG in the past, which was for editing widgets in the code. We need to add two more options here, and that is our online subsystem and online subsystem utils for online subsystem utilities. So simply, after your last element that you had in the brackets and parentheses here, just add a comma, and then add online subsystem, comma, online subsystem utils. And it has to be spelled exactly like this. Once you put them in, you can save this file and you're good to go. You don't have to do anything else with it. We just want to make sure we can access these two dependencies, because once we can access them, we can do things like include files that use those dependencies. Now you'll see that some of my code today is going to have these red underlines from IntelliSense saying can't open them. That's obviously not true. I am running and I have built right now. So these are just fake errors. Don't worry about them. You may see them as well. What's important is that when you press build solution, that it actually succeeds when it goes to the output log. So whether you have them or not important. Just make sure that everything is building successfully. Now, if you'd like, you can add all three of these includes right now. I will explain what they actually do, what each one is important for, but you can add all three right now. That way you don't have to add them later. And the three that we are adding to the base game instance.cpp is the online subsystem.h, the online session settings.h, and interfaces / online session interface.h. The first one, online subsystem.h, is important right off the bat because we are going to need the online subsystem to kind of trigger Unreal's behavior for obtaining their subsystem. Remember what I said earlier in this episode. There are different subsystems for online modes, and the different subsystems relate to things like Steam, iOS, Unreal's default method. They are different subsystems. You access the data a little bit differently, and you can do different functions on them. For example, Xbox has some to trigger achievement progress, whereas others may not have built-in achievements, and they won't have those options. Unreal has one by default, so the online subsystem is perfect. We're going to use that one to start out. We can always branch out to others as we go along. Here is our host session function. It is void uBaseGame instance : host session. Now in here, we have a lot of logic, or it looks like a lot of logic, but I'm going to explain it and it's going to be relatively simple. We're using Unreal's default subsystem, and we can obtain the subsystem or reference the subsystem using Unreal's methods. Now this comes right from the documentation, so thank you Epic for your kindness for sharing that so that we can use it and know how to utilize your functions. We can get a reference to the online subsystem by using a function iOnlineSubsystem : get. The I in front of this class stands for interface. So we're calling this interface function to obtain the online subsystem and get a reference to it. It really is that simple. It might look a little confusing, but we're just getting a reference to store in a variable for the online subsystem. We do I online subsystem pointer, and I've called it online subsystem, but you can call this whatever you want. And we're going to set it equal to I online subsystem : get. If this returns a value, it will go into this if statement. So we have to grab the online subsystem. If it can't be found for any reason, or we're using a different subsystem and this doesn't line up, this ends up failing, then we know that we don't want to do any logic inside of this if statement. So I've just added an if statement to this because if we try and get the subsystem and it fails, we don't want to go any farther. Now, another thing right from the Epic documentation, we are going to grab the online session interface. The online subsystem is the entire overall online system, but the session interface is going to have all the details about an individual session, so we can store all of our sessions in this online session interface. Now, the session is basically a match. It's a little bit more complicated than that because it could include things like selecting our characters on the screen before the actual fight, but it's really just one connected session. And we need a reference to that as well. And so the online subsystem will have the session interface, and that's what we need to grab. So, using the Epic documentation, we are able to make an I online session pointer that I've called online session interface, and we set it equal to our previous variable, online subsystem, get session interface. This is also in an if statement, because this should succeed if the online subsystem succeeded, but if it didn't for any reason, we want to make sure that we do not do the logic in here, otherwise we will get a crash. Specifically, we will get a crash when we are trying to call the create session function right here. Again, from the Epic documentation is the session settings. So we're going to need to fill out the settings for the session. We have rules for the session, such as what type of server it is, if you can join in progress, how many players can be connected, if it's private or not. We have a lot of settings which are really useful to us, and right now I've used just random arbitrary values. When we're going over it in this voiceover, I'll change them to kind of fit what we want, but this is just a default scenario. It's really not going to be this cut and dry. Now, for the next include that we had, include online session settings, we had to include that for this line right here, because we want to make a session settings variable, and I'm going to use the method that they recommend to do that. And essentially, it is going to make a shared pointer of this type. Shared pointer is not something we've covered in the series. Is we're making a new instance of the F online session settings class. That way we can fill it out for data. So we're using F online session settings as the variable type. I'm naming the variable session settings, and we're making a new instance of that class. However, they've gone a step farther to make a T shared pointer of this type, which means that you have to use make shareable around the class type that you're making. That way this pointer can actually be filled out correctly. Without going too deep into what a shared pointer is, a shared pointer is a type of smart pointer, so a pointer that will keep the data clean. It will automatically clear up any data, not allow memory leaks, and it will also do things like allow other shared pointers to reference this data, and it will keep the data as long as there is one shared pointer that still has it. So another shared pointer that loses the data, that ends up being cleaned up, is not going to affect the other shared pointers that have that data. And they typically recommend using smart pointers over raw pointers when possible anyway. So I'm going to continue to follow that because they are the experts in their online system. And while we can modify it to our liking, especially when we're doing things like this that are using their subsystem, I'm going to do that. It is going to be most likely the most efficient method. Essentially, though, all of this is just being used to create the session settings, and that is where we can actually set these individual settings. So this is also all from the Epic documentation, but we're going to configure this. This is where we have the ability to configure some things. So the session settings has a lot of parameters in here, and you can find them by typing session settings and then using the arrow operator, and it will give you a list of all the different functions or variables that you have. In my case, in this case, I have all of these here. You could either ignore them if you want them to be their default values, or fill them all out just to be extra specific. So we had the first one as allow invites. I don't see any reason not to allow invites in our sessions if you want to have a private match. However, we are going to want to have player matches and ranked matches, and the ranked matches probably won't want to allow invites, because if we do that, then people would be able to boost their matches by inviting their friend and then allowing the friend to throw. So for now, allow invites, I'd say true. We can leave it. We haven't distinguished the different types of matches just yet, but this is perfectly fine. This is something we will want to have in our game, so I'm okay to leave it for now. Now we have session settings, allow join in progress. Now, at first, you might be like, well, we probably don't want to allow join in progress, because if we join a fight in progress, who were they fighting before and who are we controlling? But there is something we can actually do here that I did not consider for a while, then I ended up thinking it would be a good idea. There are a lot of fighting games that have lobbies and tournaments, and a lot of times you can actually join and watch the fight in progress. However, often you have to join and then wait until that match is over. If you wanted to allow them to join the session in progress, even if you don't relay the information to them and they can't see it until the next match, we still will want them to be able to join the session in progress. So I'm going to let this be true. I think they can join in progress for those specific cases. Again, things like ranked matches and even player matches, you're not going to want this. This is a very specific case, but we'll go over that more as we get into more online stuff. So I'm just going to leave it as true for now. Sure, we can join in progress. Now we have B, allow join via presence. And what this means is we can have a custom search, or like you can pick the lobby you're going to join, and this would populate in a list. So I could say, I want to fight that one. This would be really useful if you have, again, like a custom match, and you can search through a list of custom matches that exist and then pick the one you want. So sure, we can do that. We, again, won't want this for things like ranked matches because we don't want them to be able to pick their opponent. But in this case, I don't see any problem with it. After that, there's another one that is allow join via presence friends only. And this is just so you can make it a friend match if it's visible to everyone, only friends, or private. I'd say it's fine to have friends only. We don't necessarily want this to be friends only and the join via presence to be true. You'd want to configure this only when the match is created or the session is created if they have chosen friends only. So I'm actually going to change this one to false. I left it true because, yes, I want that to be an option, but false by default because I think everyone should be able to see it and join unless the user specifies otherwise. I'm going to keep that one at false. Now we have B is dedicated, so if it's a dedicated server or not. In this case, I'm going to say false because with rollback especially, dedicated servers are really not necessary. A lot of times they can actually hinder it as well. It is possible to use a dedicated server with rollback, but typically it's not going to assist. It's not going to benefit you in any way because the actual time to verify the information going to the server instead of just sending client to client is a drawback, which is going to make rollback harder to actually do its job. It's going to make it less successful. So I'm going to say dedicated is false, although we could potentially explore that more in the future if anyone needs to have a dedicated server or wants to use a dedicated server, we could potentially change that to true. B, uses presence, is just something that allows us to even check for roaming instead of just matchmaking. Presence is that thing of allowing you to visualize it. So we went over allowing join via presence and allow join via presence friends only. But using presence, you could make it so it's not even visible or it's unable for other people to see it, right? It's all done behind the scenes. So I'm going to say true. There are definitely game modes where we have presence that we want to use, such as that custom lobby that I was talking about earlier. This has the added benefit of explaining things like how far along the match is in progress, if you want to show that. So again, I think true is useful here. We have B is LAN match. So LAN, for those that aren't familiar, is a type of network called local area network, which is basically where everything is going to link to the same network. So if you wanted to play a match with someone who is on the same network as you, great, you could do a LAN match. And a lot of times that is different than actually trying to matchmake, because you're going to matchmake with potentially people across the country or in your server, or if you have one server, you have a global connection that you're making, and thus you wouldn't want to do a LAN match for that. So I'm going to default it to false. We actually could make this true for testing purposes, but we'll leave it as false for now. It's not required that we have a LAN match function. Some do, some don't. Then we have B should advertise, which is if we should show this to other users or not. Similar to uses presence, but presence has more than just the visibility online. Like I said, it has actual data as well. So like if this match is ongoing, what state it's in, how long it's been playing, maybe even what users are in that match. Whereas should advertise is just if other people should be able to see it online. And we're going to want that to be true in this case. Again, custom lobbies, great reason for this. Then there's num private connections and num public connections. For this specific example, I have kept the num private connections to be 0, so it's not a private match, and num public connections to be 2. The public connections and the private connections is really just how many users can join and connect to this session. We only need 2. Even if we're doing a tag match and we have more characters, it's still only 2 players, so 2 connections are needed. You could add more for the tournaments and the lobbies. Again, you have a lot of different people that could be in a session. Even if the session is different from the actual match itself, that would be a case where you'd want more than 2. And you could have some private connections. If it's a private match, all your connections could be private. I'm going to set num private connections to be 0 for now and num public connections to be 2. Additionally, you have a few options in here that you can set that I have not added on here because they weren't in the example, but they still belong in the session settings, such as using a unique build ID. So if you have a different build version than someone else, can you try and connect or can you not? This is really useful for if changes have occurred and you don't want people on different versions to be able to connect with each other. And then there's things like anti-cheat in there as well. So you could actually try to block certain things by default by using that anti-cheat. Now, after all your session settings are set up, even though these are just defaults and not really specific to the type of match we are using, they will work for now. We are ready to use those settings and actually create a session. Now, this is another thing from the Epic documentation, and really what we're going to do is call the create session function on our online session interface. And to do that, we need at least these parameters here. We need the net ID of the player that is creating the session. What Epic does in their example is just take the local player. They get their local player like this. So they make a constant uLocalPlayer pointer called local player. And then they set it equal to get world, get first local player from controller. So they're going to get the first controller, return that player. They're then going to get the ID from that and use that as the one that is creating the session. Const is another thing we haven't really talked about in the series, but const just means that this variable is not going to change. It is more efficient to use it this way. If you have a variable that's not going to be adjusted, it's just going to be referenced and not set. Now, after we have our local player, we have our first parameter. We can access that. I'll go over that in a minute. Then we have the name of the session. So you can actually call this a specific name if you wanted. There's also a cool method that I have seen online where people just use name_game session. These enums are names. So you can type name_, and you have all these names in the Unreal enum list here. And you can do pawn, game session pointer, quaternion, root. You have all these options. So I've seen people use game session, name game session as a good example here, just because it happens to be the right type and it's good for testing. So that is something you could do. You could also give it an actual F name. So you could put in an F name here, like my game session, just like that. And it would actually be F name like that, not all capital. So this is another method you could do. But this is just the name. The second one is just the name of the session. And then we need to pass in these session settings as well. So now we're going to check and see if we can create this session and pass in all of our parameters. So if online session interface, which is this parameter right here, create session, passing in the dereferenced local player, asterisk local player, which means we're not taking the pointer value, but we're taking the actual raw data from that value. And we're going to call get preferred unique net ID. That's going to return the expected net ID. Remember that local player comes from get first local player from controller. So we're going to go to the controller, grab the first player, and grab the net ID from that, which is going to be always the default value in creating the session as far as I'm aware. Once we do this, we know who is creating the session. We'll have that ID, we'll pass it along. Then we have to add our session name, which again, you can use the enum like I had earlier. You could use the actual F name with text, my game session. You can have the users put in a name for the session. So they could put in going for achievement. They could put in, friendly match. They could put in testing new character. Then we have to pass the session settings, but we also have to dereference it. Remember that the session settings is a type of shared pointer. We're not passing the pointer along, we're passing the raw data. And so we're dereferencing it, which is what happens when you put that little asterisk in the front and you put the variable name. Now, at this point, if this succeeds, we want to know that it succeeded. That's how we'll know we've done this correctly, even though we can't see anything yet, because there's a lot more we have to do before we can actually test in-game with our current setup in the fighting game. And a simple way to do this is to just write a log. If we have this log print, we know that the session has succeeded. We know this function was called successfully, and the create session is an Unreal function, and it will only return true if the session was successfully created. So this if statement will only return true if the session is created, in which case we'll only print this log if the session was created, and that's exactly what we want to test. So I've added a UE log temp warning. Basically, it will just print to our output log with yellow text, and this is the text that we're going to print. A session has been created. Else, if it fails to return true, if it fails to create the session, we want to print this UE log. And the text is, a session has failed to be created. When we go to actually call this create session function, that is where our final include that we had here is use the interface's online session interface. It's interesting because we can actually access the online session pointer and online subsystem and the session settings without that include, but to call the create session function off of it, we do need that include. So that's where all three of these includes come into play. Now, I showed that at the start of the episode, what could make it fail to be created, and so you can actually test both of these, and if you get the same results I did, you'll know that yours is working. So let's go ahead and launch this again with a new name, my game session, and we'll make sure everything works together. And then we'll add actually calling this function from the main menu. Going to clear the log, and we're going to run the game, and I'm going to show you the output log. So we're going to go to online and host, and you'll see that a session has been created. Now, since one already exists and we're not cleaning it up anywhere, nothing like that, if we try and host the same session with the same name, we are going to get an error. So I'm going to press it again. You're going to see warning, online subsystem cannot create session, my game session already exists. And that is what we named it, my game session. So you can see that the name changed based on the text that we put in there. Session has failed to be created. So there we go. We know that our online subsystem logic is working, and we are able to host an actual session using Unreal's default online subsystem. Now we can go into the main menu and actually call this function. So let's go to our main menu widget. I'm going to go to my graph. And basically, the logic that we set up before for this little pop-out window that we have here, the host and the join, was that we were using the same logic as the regular menu, but we're checking to see if the online menu is open. So if the online menu is open, then we have host as index 0 and join as index 1. So if we go to main menu and we go to our confirm selection button, this is where we do all of our logic for when the player has pressed the button to go into that menu item. So on our switch statement, where we check what the selection was, the selection is going to be index 0. which typically would be the story button. But if the online mode button is open, it will be the host button. So going to index 0, before we were doing this logic here, and we were setting the game mode type to story. But I've added a few additional nodes just to separate that logic so that we can do both things when the time is right. So now we want to go into a branch first and check our Boolean is online submenu open. And we want to check that it's not open. If it's not open, this branch will return true. And if it returns true, then index 0 really is for the story mode. So we're going to do all the logic that we previously had in here for creating the story mode match type. But if this branch returns false, this means the online submenu is open. And if it is open, we want to call our host session function instead. So I already had a game instance reference in here. And you can see in my event graph and event construct, I get my game instance, cast it to my game instance, my base game instance type, and then I set my game instance reference off of that. Now what I'm doing is in my confirm selection, I'm checking to see if game instance reference is valid. To do this, we can get the variable, right click on it, convert it to a validated get. Assuming it is valid, we can actually call the host session function we made on it. And once you do this, you will now actually trigger the logic that we wrote in the game instance, and you will create a session. So there you go, guys. That's what we've got in today's episode. We can actually create our own session for the first time. Very exciting stuff, and we have a ton more to do this. We're going to, of course, implement the join logic next. That way we can actually make sure we can join a session. But this still is not going to actually get us a visible result because we have to change levels, we have to replicate data, we have to do all these different things so that we can actually see each other in a match and, you know, control each other. There's a ton more to do, but this is a very good first step. So anyway, guys, I hope this helped you create your own session online in your Fighting Game tutorial series. And if it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. It is completely free, and I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters again. You guys are awesome, and you really helped me make this series and keep it alive for so long. So thank you guys so much for all of that. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to discuss it with you and get those issues solved so you can keep working on your game. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I am Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.